Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a world where the smell of fresh bread doesn't drift through the air because bread doesn't exist yet. Imagine waking up to a breakfast of gritty barley porridge, cold and lumpy with nothing to soften the blow of another grueling day in ancient Greece. No warm, crusty loaves, no honey-drizzled flatbreads, just a sad, soggy mash that sticks to your teeth like damp sand. You probably wouldn't last a week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a sun-baked village around 1500 BCE, where the closest thing to bread is a dense, chewy slab of half-toasted grain. The locals call it maza, and it's about as exciting as chewing on a leather sandal. Historians still argue whether this was an early dietary experiment or just a really bad culinary phase. Meanwhile, Demeter, the goddess of harvest, watches from Olympus, shaking her head at humanity's sad, crumbless existence. But here's the quirky twist: some archaeologists believe the first bread might have been an accident. A forgotten batch of porridge left too close to a fire, hardening into something almost edible. Maybe that's why the gods finally took pity. Or maybe they just got tired of hearing mortals complain. Either way, change was coming slow warm and perfectly baked. The morning air bites sharper than usual as you rub sleep from your eyes. Something's wrong. The fields outside your village, like normally golden with ripe grain, now glisten white under an unnatural frost. Chickens huddle together confused by this sudden winter in harvest season. Even the olive trees, those stubborn survivors, droop under the weight of icicles. Demeter has vanished, not the quiet absence of a god who stepped out for ambrosia. This is the raging disappearance of a deity scorned. The earth itself holds its breath, terrified of what comes next. Crops wither mid-stalk. Streams freeze solid while you watch. That basket of maza you were saving, now just a frozen brick even the dogs won't touch. Historians still argue whether this was literal climate change or just really good storytelling by ancient bards. But here's the fringe detail they don't teach you. Some clay tablets suggest certain villages tried sacrificing their shoes to end the famine. Apparently, leather sandals smelled close enough to fertile earth to maybe possibly please the goddess. It went as well as you'd expect. Meanwhile, on Olympus, the other gods are starting to notice. Ares complains his war campaigns keep getting delayed by starving soldiers. Dionysus whines about frozen grapes. Even Hades, yes, that Hades, finds the underworld getting suspiciously crowded as mortals drop like flies. But nobody dares say what they're all thinking, until the little bird whispers where Demeter might be. Your stomach growls louder than Cerberus as you shuffle through the frozen village square. People huddle around pathetic fires fueled by broken furniture, turns out, when you're starving. Grandma's oaken stool looks remarkably flammable. A child licks frost off a plow blade. Somewhere a donkey eats its own reins. This isn't just hunger, it's the kind of desperate that makes mortals do stupid things like that one guy trying to barter his left sandal for 3 shriveled olives. News spreads slower than a frozen snail, but eventually you hear the whispers. Persephone's missing too. The connection clicks like an arthritic knee. Demeter isn't just moody, she's broken. And broken goddesses make for very bad harvests. Local priests sacrifice a scrawny goat, the last one alive, ribs poking through its patchy fur, but the smoke won't rise in the dead still air. Just hovers above the altar like a bad omen you can smell. Here's the mainstream fact. Ancient Greeks believed seasons changed because of Persephone's time in the underworld. But the quirky tidbit. Some versions claim Hades didn't just kidnap her, he courted her with a pomegranate because, and I quote, underworld dating etiquette is complicated. Historians still argue whether this was romantic or just really bad fruit symbolism. You're weighing whether to eat clay pottery, it's basically pre-chewed grain, right when a distant rumble shakes the ice from the rooftops. Somewhere far below your frostbitten feet, a deal is being struck over 6 measly seeds. The moment that first pomegranate seed bursts between Persephone's teeth, the underworld collectively holds its breath. Hades leans forward on his obsidian throne, suddenly realizing he may have underestimated the bargaining power of snack foods. Up on the surface, you're too busy gnawing on frozen tree bark to notice the subtle shift, but the earth does. Somewhere deep below, roots begin whispering to each other in a language older than gods. Now you'd think eating 6 little seeds wouldn't warrant 6 months of annual separation, but divine contracts are weirdly specific. The fates probably drafted the fine print while drunk on nectar again. Mainstream myth says this explains seasons, but here's the quirky bit. Some temple inscriptions suggest Persephone actually liked the underworld's nightlife. Where else could a goddess find a 24-hour pomegranate buffet and 0 sunlight-induced hangovers? Historians still argue whether Hades was a kidnapper or just the world's most dramatic food delivery guy. Meanwhile, Demeter's sitting in a mortal hovel because sulking on Olympus is too mainstream when she feels that a single blade of grass poking through the frost near her sandal. The sigh she lets out thaws entire valleys. Back in your village, you're mid-bite on a suspiciously soft sandal strap when the icicles start dripping. The donkey stops chewing its reins. Somewhere, a priest faints directly into the suddenly liquid sacrificial pool, and floating on the spring-scented breeze comes the sound every starving Greek has waited for, the unmistakable thump of a divine kneading bowl hitting a marble countertop. The first thing you smell is yeast, real, honest-to-Olympus yeast wafting from Demeter's makeshift temple bakery. It's been so long since you've smelled anything besides frost and despair that your knees nearly buckle. The goddess herself stands elbow-deep in dough muttering about incompetent mortals, while flour dusts her braids like edible snow. Turns out divine baking involves more than just waving a wheat stalk. Demeter demonstrates proper kneading technique using a mortar and pestle, normally reserved for crushing medicinal herbs. No, you oaf clockwise motions like the rotation of the seasons, she snaps at a trembling priest. Historians still argue whether these early bread-making sessions were religious ceremonies or just the world's first cooking show. Here's the quirky tidbit they don't mention in textbooks. Demeter allegedly cursed the first mortal who asked for gluten-free options. The poor soul reportedly turned into a very confused-looking stalk of spelt. You're handed a lump of dough that suspiciously resembles your future. Now watch closely, Demeter says, sliding the clay baking slab into glowing embers. The secret is in the waiting. As the first golden crust forms, something miraculous happens. The village dogs stop looking at children like walking sausages. The scent of burning fills your nostrils, not the good toasty kind, but the unmistakable reek of culinary failure. Your first attempt at bread lies blackened on the hearthstone, a charcoal briquette that would make Hades himself wince. Demeter pinches the bridge of her nose with flour-dusted fingers. "By my mother's sacred harvest," she mutters, "how do you people survive without divine intervention? Turns out ancient ovens were trickier than they looked. That clay dome you built collapsed mid-bake like a titan with weak ankles." The mainstream historical record claims, "Early bread was dense and flat, but the truth is far worse. Your village's first collective efforts could double as roofing tiles, or in desperate times, improvised weaponry." Here's the quirky detail archaeologists love. Some of these proto-breads survived in the archaeological record so well, scholars initially mistook them for early pottery. Historians still argue whether the infamous linear A loaf from Crete was actual writing or just a particularly ambitious baker's scoring pattern gone wrong. Demeter sighs and snaps her fingers. A perfect golden loaf materializes in midair. "Observe," she says, tearing it open with a crackle that echoes through the suddenly silent village. Steam rises like a benevolent spirit as she hands you the first bite, and just like that, you understand why mortals would later worship bakers as minor deities. That mysterious bubbling in your abandoned dough bowl isn't just fermentation. It's the closest thing to divine magic most mortals will ever witness. You poke the frothy mass, suspiciously half expecting it to bite back. Demeter calls it yeast, but the village elders whisper it's clearly the work of Dionysus, after one of his wine-soaked benders. Turns out capturing wild yeast is like herding drunken satyrs. Just when you think you've got it contained, it escapes and gets into something embarrassing. The mainstream historical record credits Egyptians with perfecting leavened bread. But here's the quirky truth. Some of the earliest Greek yeast starters were allegedly begun with foam scraped off sacred beer vats. Historians still argue whether this was culinary innovation or just drunk priests getting creative with their leftovers. You're stirring your starter dubbed Bacchus's Revenge for its particularly violent bubbling when a farmer bursts in with news someone's grain store has transformed into a foaming, hissing monster. Demeter takes one look at the glutinous blob oozing from the jars and does something unexpected, she laughs. Not her usual disapproving goddess chuckle, but full Olympian belly laughter that makes nearby olive trees spontaneously fruit. At last, she wheezes, wiping ambrosia tears from her eyes. You've discovered the most important baking lesson of all. Sometimes the best things happen by complete accident. The temple bakery hums with activity before dawn priests moving like well-flowered shadows between glowing hearths. What began as divine instruction has turned into a full-blown bread monopoly. Turns out, when you control the ovens, you control the people. The head priest inspects each loaf like a general reviewing troops, rejecting any with insufficient holy rise and pocketing the best for the god's altar and, coincidentally, his own dinner. Mainstream history remembers these temple bakeries as early examples of organized food production. But the quirky truth is far more entertaining. Some temple records show priests developing elaborate, divine grading systems, where bread quality determined your favor with the gods. A perfectly risen loaf might earn Demeter's blessing, while a dense brick could get you assigned extra harvest duties. Historians still argue whether this was spiritual guidance or the world's first restaurant review system. You're kneading dough under the watchful eye of a junior priest when you notice something odd. The sacred grain stores seem to shrink faster than the distribution records can explain. Rumor has it, certain priests have developed a thriving black market trading blessed breadcrumbs as fertility charms. Demeter pretends not to notice, though her occasional thunderous sighs suggest the goddess of agriculture might also be the patron saint of workplace theft. As the scent of baking bread drifts over the city walls, something unprecedented happens nearby. Warring factions declare a temporary truce. Turns out nothing fosters diplomacy like the promise of warm, buttered bread. The invitation arrives via a very nervous-looking sparrow. Zeus himself demands a tasting symposium of mortal bread innovations. Apparently, Olympus has grown tired of ambrosia and wants to slum it with some rustic carbs. The village bakers panic. This is the divine equivalent of a Michelin star inspection, except with more lightning bolts and capricious smiting. You're assigned to create the Olympian special, a loaf that somehow needs to be simultaneously rustic, yet God-worthy. Mainstream myth never mentions this culinary summit, but temple carvings depict the event in suspicious detail, especially Dionysus face-planting into a pile of flatbread after sampling one too many wine-soaked loaves. Historians still argue whether this was an actual historical event or just ancient propaganda to promote local bakeries. Here's the quirky detail that survived in fragments Hestia, goddess of the hearth, allegedly smuggled in a loaf baked by mortal hands, centuries earlier preserved through some divine food storage hack, just to prove how far baking had come. The Olympians react like food critics at a peasant tavern with Poseidon complaining his bread isn't salty enough, and Aphrodite insisting her loaf be shaped like a swan. When Zeus finally takes his first bite of your village's signature sesame-crusted sourdough, the resulting thunderclap shatters every wine cup in the room. Acceptable, he booms, already reaching for his third loaf. Demeter's smirk could power 1,000 grain mills. The village agora now smells less like a marketplace and more like a carbohydrate crime scene. Demeter's bread revolution has spawned some questionable innovations. Over in the corner, a shady merchant peddles Zeus-approved lightning bolt-shaped breadsticks, absolutely not blessed by anyone. Nearby, an overzealous baker demonstrates his new 12-grain Herculean loaf that reportedly requires divine strength just to chew. Mainstream history focuses on bread's importance in ancient diets, but court records reveal its darker role. One particularly creative punishment involved forcing criminals to eat nothing but unsalted, unleavened bread for a month of fate considered worse than Hades' realm by some. Historians still argue whether this was humane punishment or cruel and unusual gluten torture. Here's the quirky bit: bakers developed secret flour blends like alchemists crafting potions. One surviving recipe calls for moonlight-kissed barley and water carried by virgins at dawn, ingredients that suspiciously justified charging triple the price. You catch Demeter rolling her eyes as a baker claims his special starter was passed down directly from her divine hands. The goddess finally intervenes when someone tries selling Persephone's pomegranate-infused buns with suggestive shaping. With a flick of her wrist, the offending pastries transform back into plain wheat. Some things, she sighs, even immortality doesn't prepare you for. The festival preparations have reached Dionysian levels of excess. What began as a simple harvest celebration has morphed into a bread orgy that would make Caligula blush. Bakers compete to construct increasingly absurd edible monuments: a life-sized Athena replica in whole wheat, an Apollo chariot with sesame seed wheels, even an entirely functional if somewhat sticky lyre made from twisted dough. Mainstream history remembers these Thesmophoria festivals as women-only religious events, but the unofficial bakery competitions were apparently open to all. Temple records mention a particularly intense rivalry between two baker brothers that ended with an olive oil fire and several ruined togas. Historians still argue whether the famous Bread Olympics were actual events or just drunken tavern tales. Here's the quirky truth. Some festival bread sculptures contained hidden prizes bite into the right roll, and you might find a silver drachma, or if you're unlucky, the baker's lost thumb ring. You're admiring a particularly ambitious dough replica of Mount Olympus when Demeter materializes beside you nibbling on a miniature edible Zeus. Mortals, she muses watching a baker frantically repair a collapsing bread Pegasus wing. You take my simple gift and turn it into this. But there's pride in her voice as the first festival loaves are torn apart in a cloud of warm crumbs and laughter. The harbor smells of salt and intrigue as you inspect the sailors' most precious cargo. Not spices or silks, but hardened discs of bread so durable they could survive Poseidon's worst moods. Naval hardtack represents baking's most brutalist era. These wheat bricks double as construction materials in a pinch. One grizzled captain demonstrates by driving a nail with his day-old loaf. Mainstream history credits these rations for enabling ancient naval dominance, but ship logs reveal the darker truth. Sailors developed elaborate softening rituals, soaking hardtack in wine seawater, or occasionally tears. Historians still argue whether the infamous Minoan bread revolt was sparked by stale rations or just really poor seasoning choices. Here's the quirky detail only ship's cooks knew. Some hardtack was deliberately baked with tiny holes not for aesthetics, but so sailors could string them as emergency buoyancy aids. You're testing this theory by attempting to float your biscuit in a wine jug when Demeter appears looking mildly offended. My grain deserves better than this. She sighs, transforming your rock-hard ration into a fluffy roll. The sudden change in texture causes nearby sailors to weep openly. By dusk, every ship in harbor sports makeshift ovens because nothing motivates innovation like the threat of a goddess judging your baking skills. The rhythmic clack-clack of millstones echoes through the valley, a sound so constant it blends into the landscape like cicada song. You're standing in one of Demeter's experimental mills where donkeys plod endless circles and river water turns grain into something finer than temple incense. It's hot, dusty work that leaves your tunic permanently beige, but there's magic in watching golden kernels become powdery potential. Mainstream history attributes watermill development to practical Romans, but scattered Greek poems reference the goddesses' turning wheels centuries earlier. The quirky truth: some early mills doubled as clandestine meeting spots. Bakers would adjust grind levels to signal when the coast was clear for secret grain exchanges. Historians still argue whether certain mill designs were engineering breakthroughs or just attempts to hide flour from tax collectors. Demeter watches from the shade as you wrestle with a jammed millstone. The best inventions, she says, flicking a speck of flour from her sleeve, come from solving the simplest problems. She doesn't lift a finger to help, but the donkey suddenly finds renewed energy, possibly because it now bears an uncanny resemblance to her sacred sows. By sunset, your first sack of true white flour sits heavy in your arms. It smells like possibility and also like donkey sweat, but mostly possibility. The underworld's banquet hall smells suspiciously like a bakery, which shouldn't be possible given the complete absence of sunlight, yeast, or joy. Yet here you stand watching Hades himself nibble on a perfectly crusted roll from a hidden basket beneath his throne. Persephone smirks as crumbs dust his shadowy beard. What? The death god grumbles. A millennia of judging souls builds an appetite. Mainstream myth paints Hades as strictly an ambrosia traditionalist, but palace kitchen records tell a different story. The quirky detail his chefs allegedly used geothermal vents as proofing chambers, creating breads with hellish rise that surface bakers could never replicate. Historians still argue whether these underworld recipes were myth or early sourdough experimentation. You're sampling a surprisingly airy pomegranate rye hybrid when Cerberus whines for crust like an overgrown lapdog. Persephone slips you a napkin woven from ghostly flax. Mother's influence runs deeper than she thinks, she whispers. Even here in the land where nothing grows, the memory of warm bread lingers like a promise. As you're escorted back to the surface, the faint scent of baking follows you up the stony path. Proof that some comforts transcend even divine boundaries. The village square lies quiet under a blanket of stars, the ovens cooling, but still radiating gentle warmth like sleeping beasts. You cradle a final piece of bread, this one made from grain. You planted, milled, and baked yourself without divine intervention, though you did whisper a quick prayer to Demeter just in case. It's imperfect, slightly lopsided with a crust that could double as armor, but it's unquestionably wonderfully bred. Mainstream history will record this as the dawn of agriculture's golden age, but you know the truth was messier. The quirky reality. Those first successful loaves probably contained bits of pottery shards, a beetle or two, and enough trial and error to fill Tartarus. Historians will still argue whether bread shaped civilization or merely rode its coattails, but right now, as the last villagers shuffle home with full bellies, the distinction hardly matters. Demeter's presence lingers in the yeasty air, though she hasn't been seen since moonrise. Perhaps she's off teaching another starving village, or maybe she's finally enjoying some well-earned ambrosia. Either way, her gift remains in every kneaded loaf and every harvest song and the simple magic of flour and water and time. You take one last bite as the fireflies blink in rhythm with the slowing mill wheel. The taste is comfort. The taste is home. The taste is against all odds the future. And so we leave this story where all the best ones end, not with a finale, but with a gentle exhale. The embers of village ovens glow like distant stars, now each one a tiny sun in its own right. That faint yeasty perfume still lingers on the night breeze if you breathe deeply enough, mingling with the scent of dew-kissed wheat fields stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere between myth and history, between hunger and abundance, between mortal hands and divine guidance, bread became more than sustenance. It became memory. It became art. It became the quiet hero of civilization's unending story. So let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of those ancient millstones. In and out. In and out. Picture those first golden crusts emerging from hearths, steam curling toward the heavens like grateful prayers. The gods may have given the gift, but it was ordinary hands like yours that shaped it into something extraordinary. As sleep pulls you under, know this. The ovens will keep their warmth, the grain will keep its promise, and somewhere beyond your fading thoughts, Demeter smiles at every new loaf that rises beneath the morning sun.